In just 10 minutes, Ibrahim Traoré dismantled decades of colonial arrogance, and one Oxford professor never recovered. The room was packed. Mahogany-paneled walls, velvet drapes, and the quiet hum of academic prestige. Cameras clicked. Students leaned forward. The professor, silver-haired, sharp-suited, had just finished his question. It wasn't a question, really, more like a veiled dismissal. A smirk curled at the edge of his mouth. Mr. Traoré, with all due respect, how can a country like Burkina Faso claim to lead when it still struggles to govern? Silence. Traoré didn't flinch. He adjusted the mic, looked up, and began. Burkina Faso does not struggle to govern. It struggles to breathe under the weight of centuries of theft disguised as aid, and lectures disguised as diplomacy. Gasps. A few chuckles. The professor blinked. Traoré continued, voice steady, eyes locked on his target. You speak of leadership as if it's granted by institutions like this one. But leadership is earned in the trenches, not in ivory towers. And if you want to understand Africa, you must first stop trying to explain it. The room shifted. Students exchanged glances. One began recording. The professor opened his mouth, then closed it again. Traoré leaned back. We do not need permission to be sovereign. We need you to stop pretending you invented the concept. A pause, then applause. Scattered at first, then swelling. The professor sat frozen, his legacy unraveling in real time. Outside, Twitter lit up. Inside, the air was electric. A single speech had cracked the polished veneer of Western intellectual dominance. But what led to this explosive moment was even more shocking. Oxford had seen its share of debates, polished, rehearsed, and predictably polite. But this panel was different. The topic, African governance in the 21st century. The guests, a mix of Western academics, policy analysts, and one unexpected name, Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso. His presence alone raised eyebrows, not because he lacked credentials, but because he didn't fit the mold. The room buzzed with quiet tension. Students filled the aisles, journalists hovered near the back, and faculty members whispered behind folded programs. On stage, the moderator introduced each speaker with glowing praise until he reached Traoré. And finally, we welcome President Traoré, whose recent rise has sparked discussion. Discussion, a word that masked discomfort, a word that signaled doubt. From the outset, the tone was clear. The professor seated beside Traoré, a man who'd authored multiple books on post-colonial Africa, spoke with the confidence of someone who believed he understood the continent better than those who lived it. His questions weren't questions. They were declarations dressed as inquiry. Isn't it true, he began, that African leadership often lacks the institutional maturity required for democratic stability? Traoré listened, calm, unshaken. The professor continued, citing statistics, referencing think tanks, and quoting philosophers, none of whom had ever set foot in Ouagadougou. The subtext was unmistakable. Africa was a subject to be studied, not a voice to be heard. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The audience wasn't just listening, they were watching. Watching the contrast between polished arrogance and lived experience. Between theory and truth. Traoré's silence wasn't passive. It was loaded. Every glance, every pause, every breath was a quiet rebellion against the narrative being spun around him. And then, he spoke. What happened next didn't just shake the room. It shook the entire narrative of who gets to define truth. Professor Reginald Carrington was no stranger to applause. A tenured scholar at Oxford, author of 6 books on post-colonial governance, and a frequent guest on international panels, he had built a career on dissecting African politics from safe distance. His lectures were filled with polished rhetoric, peppered with references to Locke, Hobbes, and the occasional nod to Fanon, though always with a caveat. Radical thinkers, he'd say, must be read with caution. Carrington's reputation was built on a paradox. He claimed to champion African development while subtly reinforcing the idea that true governance could only be understood and validated through Western frameworks. His students admired his eloquence, But critics noted a pattern. He spoke of African nations as experiments, their leaders as charismatic anomalies, and their revolutions as emotional responses to structural instability. In one televised interview, he remarked, "Africa's challenge isn't corruption, it's cultural immaturity. Institutions must precede identity." The backlash was swift, but Carrington dismissed it as Twitter noise. He believed in the long arc of academia, not the fleeting outrage of the digital age. So when he was invited to moderate the Oxford panel on African governance, he saw it as another opportunity to reinforce his legacy. The inclusion of Ibrahim Traoré, however, was a surprise. A populist, he muttered to a colleague before the event. Charismatic, yes, but untested, and frankly, unrefined. Carrington had done his homework, or so he thought. He skimmed Traoré's speeches, noted his military background, and dismissed him as another firebrand leader with limited intellectual depth. "Let's see how he handles a real debate," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. From the moment Traoré entered the hall, Carrington's demeanor shifted. He greeted the president with a firm handshake and a rehearsed smile, but his eyes betrayed skepticism. During the introductions, he emphasized the credentials of the other panelists, Harvard, LSE, Sciences PA, and introduced Traoré last, with a tone that bordered on patronizing. And finally, President Traoré, who has recently emerged as a prominent voice in West African politics. The first question Carrington posed was a trap. Given Burkina Faso's ongoing challenges with democratic consolidation, how do you reconcile your leadership with the principles of liberal governance? It was a question designed not to elicit insight, but to expose perceived inadequacy. The phrasing was clinical, the tone condescending. And when Traoré responded with measured clarity, Carrington interrupted. "Yes, but surely you must admit that your country lacks the institutional depth required for sustained reform." There was a murmur in the audience. Traoré paused, then continued. Carrington leaned back, arms crossed, and whispered to the moderator, "He's articulate, but the accent, it's thick. Hard to follow." That whisper, caught on a hot mic, would later circulate online. But in the moment, Carrington remained confident. He believed he was winning. He believed the audience was nodding with him, not at him. He didn't realize the tide was turning. He didn't see the students leaning in, not to Carrington's polished critiques, but to Traoré's grounded truths. He didn't notice the subtle shift in energy, the way the room began to pulse with anticipation. Carrington had spent decades dissecting Africa from a distance. Traoré had lived it, and in that room, distance was no longer protection. But he didn't realize he was about to be publicly dismantled by a man who knew the cost of truth. Before the applause, before the headlines, before the 10 minutes that would shake Oxford to its core, Ibrahim Traoré was a soldier. Not the kind who sought power, the kind who carried it quietly, through discipline, through duty, through the weight of watching his country bleed while the world looked away. Born in Kera, a modest town in Burkina Faso, Traoré grew up in a nation stitched together by resilience and scarred by exploitation. His childhood was marked not by privilege, but by questions. Why were foreign companies richer than the villages they mined? Why did aid come with conditions? Why did dignity feel like a luxury? He joined the military young, not for glory, for purpose. He rose through the ranks not by charm, but by conviction. His peers described him as quiet, focused, unshakable. He didn't speak often, but when he did, people listened. Because his words weren't rehearsed, they were lived. Traoré saw firsthand the fractures in Burkina Faso's governance. Corruption wasn't just a headline, it was a daily reality. Foreign influence wasn't subtle, it was suffocating. And sovereignty wasn't theoretical, it was stolen piece by piece behind closed doors and diplomatic smiles. So when he stepped into leadership, it wasn't ambition, it was necessity. He didn't arrive with fanfare, he arrived with a promise. That Burkina Faso would no longer be spoken for, that its future would be written by its own hands, not dictated by think tanks or foreign ministries. His speeches were short, his policies bold. He cut ties with exploitative contracts. He demanded respect on the international stage. And he reminded his people, not with slogans, but with action, that they mattered. But Traoré wasn't just fighting for Burkina Faso. He was fighting for every African nation that had been told to wait its turn. For every leader mocked for speaking truth with an accent. For every student who read about their homeland in books written by outsiders. That's why he accepted the Oxford invitation. Not to be validated, to confront the very architecture of intellectual gatekeeping. He knew what he was walking into. He knew the tone, the glances, the questions that would come. But he also knew something else, something the professor didn't. Clarity. Clarity of purpose. Clarity of history. Clarity of what it means to lead not from above, but from within. And that clarity is exactly what made his next words so devastating. The professor adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and spoke with the kind of confidence that only decades of unchecked authority could produce. President Traoré, he began, while your passion is admirable, surely you must concede that Burkina Faso's current trajectory lacks the institutional sophistication required for long-term democratic stability. There was again the coded language of dismissal. Sophistication. Stability. Words that sounded neutral but dripped with condescension. Traoré didn't flinch. The professor continued, his voice rising just enough to signal control. Your reforms, while bold, seem reactive. Wouldn't it be more prudent to defer to established models of governance, ones that have proven effective in the West? A few heads nodded. Others stiffened. The tension was no longer subtle. Traoré sat still. His fingers rested lightly on the table. He waited, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he knew the power of silence. The moderator glanced nervously between them. Cameras zoomed in. Students leaned forward. And then Traoré leaned into the mic. Professor, he said, voice calm, deliberate. You speak of prudence as if it were a universal virtue. But prudence, in our context, has meant waiting while our resources are extracted, our leaders are undermined, and our people are told to be patient. The room grew tense. Eyes darted. Cameras rolled. Traoré continued. You ask us to follow models that were never designed for us. Models that collapse when applied to our realities. And when we resist, we're labeled unstable. The professor opened his mouth, but Traoré didn't stop. You speak of democracy as if it were a gift, but we know it is a struggle to define ourselves without permission, a struggle to lead without apology. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The professor's expression shifted from confident to cautious. Traoré leaned back. So no, I will not defer. I will not mimic. I will not ask for validation from those who still see us as subjects of study. The silence that followed was heavy, charged, transformative. What he said next would echo far beyond Oxford walls. Traoré's fingers tapped once on the table. The sound was soft, but it cut through the silence like a drumbeat before war. He leaned forward, eyes steady, voice low. Professor Carrington, he began, you've spent your life studying Africa. I've spent mine living it. A hush fell over the room. The professor shifted in his seat, lips pursed, waiting for the usual diplomatic tone. But Traoré wasn't here to perform politeness. You speak of institutions, Traoré continued, as if they were sacred, as if their mere existence guarantees justice. But let me ask you, what institution protected Thomas Sankara when foreign interests decided his vision was too dangerous? Carrington blinked. No answer. Traoré didn't wait. What institution intervened when France siphoned billions from the CFA zone, while our schools crumbled and our hospitals ran dry? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Students glanced at each other. Some began recording. You praise stability, Traoré said, but whose stability? The kind that keeps African nations dependent? The kind that rewards silence and punishes sovereignty? Carrington opened his mouth, but Traoré raised a hand. You say we lack sophistication, but sophistication is not the ability to quote Locke. It is the ability to lead with integrity when the world profits from your failure. The professor's face flushed. He reached for his water, hand trembling slightly. Traoré's voice grew firmer. I did not come here to be evaluated. I came here to remind you, and everyone listening, that Africa is not your thesis. It is not your experiment. It is not your intellectual playground. A few claps broke out. Carrington glanced nervously toward the moderator, who looked frozen. Traoré stood. You mock my accent, but let me tell you what this accent carries. It carries the voices of miners who dig cobalt for your phones. It carries the prayers of mothers who bury their children because the West sends weapons instead of medicine. It carries the weight of a continent that has been told to wait again and again, while others write its story. Now the clapping grew louder. A student stood up, fist clenched at their side. Carrington tried to interject. Mr. President, But Traoré didn't stop. You call us reactive, but we are reacting to centuries of theft, centuries of humiliation, centuries of being told we are not ready, by those who never wanted us to be. The professor's voice faltered. I didn't mean. Traoré turned to him, eyes sharp. You didn't mean to be condescending. But condescension is not always loud. Sometimes it wears a suit. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it sits on panels and asks questions that sound academic but are designed to diminish. The room was no longer passive. It was alive. Students clapped. One shouted, "Say it again." Another stood up, phone raised high. Traoré stepped back. We do not need your permission to be free. We do not need your frameworks to be legitimate. We do not need your applause to be proud. Carrington looked down. His hands clenched. His legacy, built on lectures and papers, was unraveling in real time. Traoré's final words rang out. We are not asking to be understood. We are demanding to be respected. The applause was thunderous. The professor didn't speak again. Students began clapping. One stood up. The professor looked down. It was over. But the real fallout hadn't even begun. The moment Traoré stepped off the stage, the internet lit up like wildfire. Within minutes, clips of his speech flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. The hashtag #TraoréTruth surged to the top of global trends. One video, a close-up of the professor's stunned silence, racked up 2 million views in under an hour. The caption read, "When colonial arrogance meets lived reality." Reaction videos poured in. Students from Nairobi to New York filmed themselves watching the speech, pausing to shout, cry, and cheer. One creator, a Nigerian-American law student, posted, "I've never felt so seen." Traoré didn't just speak, he rewrote the syllabus. Memes followed. A split-screen image showed the professor's face mid-question beside Traoré's mic drop moment, with the caption, "Oxford just got schooled." Another showed Traoré walking away from the podium with flames behind him, tagged 10 minutes. One legacy. Think pieces emerged from every corner of the internet. The Guardian ran a headline, "The speech that shook Oxford, Ibrahim Traoré and the New African Voice." Al Jazeera called it a reckoning in real time. Even the New York Times weighed in, publishing an op-ed titled "When Truth Doesn't Need a Degree." Academic institutions scrambled to respond. Oxford released a statement praising the diversity of perspectives, while quietly distancing itself from Carrington's remarks. A student-led petition demanded the university revise its curriculum to include more African-authored texts. Within days, over 50,000 signatures had poured in. Carrington, once revered, found himself at the center of a storm. His past comments were dredged up, dissected, and debated. Former students spoke out. One wrote, "He taught us to question everything, except him." Another posted, "Now I understand why his lectures felt like colonization with footnotes." Meanwhile, Traoré's speech was translated into 6 languages. African youth groups shared it as a rallying cry. University professors in Ghana and Senegal began incorporating it into their syllabi. A mural of Traoré appeared overnight in Johannesburg, painted with the words, "We speak now." The ripple effect wasn't just academic. It was cultural, emotional, generational. Traoré had done more than dismantle a professor's argument. He had cracked open a global conversation about who gets to speak, who gets to teach, and who gets to define truth. And as the professor's reputation crumbled, Traoré's legacy soared. The dust had barely settled, but the impact was already irreversible. What Ibrahim Traoré did in that room wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reclamation of voice, of dignity, of the right to define one's own reality without the filter of foreign approval. In 10 minutes, he didn't just challenge a professor, he challenged a system. One built on the assumption that knowledge flows in one direction, from west to the rest. But Traoré flipped the current. He reminded the world that truth doesn't need a British accent. It needs courage. And courage, in that moment, looked like a young African leader standing in the heart of an institution that had, for centuries, shaped the global narrative about his continent, and saying no more. It was more than political theater. It was intellectual justice. For too long, African voices had been invited to speak only when they echoed Western frameworks. For too long, lived experience had been dismissed as anecdotal, while detached analysis was elevated as objective. Traoré shattered that illusion. He made it clear that the power of truth lies not in how it's packaged, but in who dares to speak it. His words reverberated far beyond Oxford. In classrooms across Africa, students watched and saw themselves, not as subjects of study, but as authors of history. In immigrant communities across Europe and America, his speech became a rallying cry that identity is not a liability and pride is not arrogance. Justice, humility, sovereignty, these weren't just abstract ideals. They were embodied in every syllable Traoré spoke. He didn't posture. He didn't pander. He simply told the truth and let the truth do the work. And the truth was undeniable. That Africa is not waiting to be saved. That its leaders are not waiting to be taught. That its people are not waiting to be understood. They are speaking loudly, clearly, unapologetically. Traoré's speech marked a turning point, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the global discourse on power and legitimacy. It forced institutions to confront their biases. It forced audiences to question their assumptions. And it forced a professor to reckon with the limits of his authority. But most importantly, it gave permission. Permission to every young African who's ever been told to tone it down. To every immigrant who's ever been asked to prove their worth. To every student who's ever been told their story was too emotional, too personal, too raw. Permission to speak. Because in just 10 minutes, Ibrahim Traoré didn't just defend his country. He defended the right to be heard. And in doing so, he gave a generation permission to speak. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult. He didn't flinch. And yet, Ibrahim Traoré's 10-minute speech at Oxford didn't just silence a professor. It shattered a hierarchy. In a room built to preserve prestige, he brought truth. In a space designed to question others, he questioned the questioners. And in doing so, he reminded the world that dignity doesn't come from titles. It comes from standing tall when others expect you to shrink. This wasn't just a moment. It was a message to every student who's been talked over, to every immigrant who's been underestimated, to every voice that's been told it's too raw, too real, too inconvenient. This was your vindication. Traoré didn't just speak for Burkina Faso. He spoke for anyone who's ever been asked to prove their worth before being allowed to speak. So if you believe truth should speak louder than titles, subscribe, share, and let the world hear your voice. Because sometimes 10 minutes is all it takes to change history.